call our March 18th meeting of the Winston-Salem Metropolitan Planning Organization, TAC Committee, to order. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Thank you for being here. I remind you, if you are not speaking, if you would mute yourself so that we don't pick up a lot of background noises, and we can enjoy each other's talking and speaking much clearer there. For those who may be watching or for the record, today's meeting will be a virtual meeting because of Governor Cooper's safe at home order. Members of the TAC will be participating virtually on this platform. All members will vote by roll call, and that vote will be recorded by Kirk, and he will call the roll at which time you'll vote. One other reminder, members, if you've had a chance to look at today's agenda, if you anticipate or believe that you have any conflict of interest with any of the items that are coming before us today, please indicate that now, and we can excuse you from those votes. Anybody have a conflict of interest? Very good, thank you. Kirk, do we have anybody in line to make a public comment?
We do not, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, very good. Members, there's been a slight change in the agenda that was sent out. We have added a 3A. And what we've done is basically broken down the item number 3, the consolidation of the draft fiscal 21 and 22 and the amendment into 2 pieces. I think somebody much smarter than myself indicated that we probably needed to take those as 2 separate actions. So we will have a 3A, number 3 and a 3A. Members, you've had a chance to review the minutes from our last meeting. Are there any changes, additions, deletions, subtractions? Not want to entertain a motion to approve?
Rick Cross motion, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Cross.
Edie Adams, second.
Thank you, Ms. Adams. That's a second. Any other discussion? Kirk, please call the roll.
Mayor Joines.
Yes.
Mr. Clark. Robert.
I was muted.
Was that a yes, Mr. Clark?
Yes, I thought
Thank you.
unmuted.
Ms. Adams.
Yes.
Rick Cross.
Yes.
Mr. Rocket.
Yes.
Ms. Fulton.
Yes.
Chairman Horn.
Yes.
Mr. Marion.
Yes.
Mr. Hutchins.
Yes.
Mr. Shores.
Yes.
Mr. Morris.
Yes.
Mr. Clark. Willie.
Yes.
Are there any voting members that I missed that came in recently?
Mayor John Byram?
Thank you, Mr. Byram. And your vote?
Yes.
Thank you. Motion passes
This is
unanimously.
Benita Finney.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, Ms. Finney, your vote?
That's fine. I'm on the telephone instead of on the screen, so it's easy to skip that. My vote is yes.
Thank you.
Very good. Is that everyone? Thank you. That motion and second passes unanimously. Kelly, you have the first item on our agenda, and this is the one we talked about earlier that we're going to break into 2. So this is consideration of draft fiscal 2021-22 Unified Planning Work Program of our Winston-Salem MPO.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, everybody. As mentioned before, the item before you, or now items, are the first part is the consideration of the draft fiscal year 2021-2022 Unified Planning Work Program, and the 3A would then be the consideration of the amendments to the fiscal year 2020-2021 PWP for the MPO. All MPOs that have been designated as transportation management areas are required to develop an annual unified planning work program in coordination with Federal Transit Administration. Each year, the MPO is required to develop and approve this program for transportation and transit planning. The UPWP identifies what transportation and transit planning projects and work tasks will be completed during the fiscal year, and it's also the estimate of the amount of federal and state highway and transit planning funds that will be used to complete the work, in addition to the local funding matches. As part of our UPWP this year, there were 2 requests for studies or plans. The Village of Clements requested $50,000 for a bicycle and pedestrian study, and the City of Winston-Salem is requesting $150,000 to hire a consultant to ensure that the NPO's congestion management plan is used effectively and efficiently. Both of these studies that are highlighted in the attached work program, and the city and the village are both responsible for the 20% match. For the 3A portion of our action item, the city is requesting an addition of $100,000 to their Winston-Salem Transit Authority route study. This would amend, as I mentioned, the fiscal year 2020-2021 PWP, and the amount for that study would then be $200,000, and making the match $16,000 for making the match for the city. I think about $16,000. I'm sorry, $40,000. I apologize. So included in your packet, as I mentioned, is the 2021-2022 Unified Planning Work Program, along with the amendments to the 2020-2021 work program. I am available for any questions. I apologize for any confusion.
Any questions for Kelly? Kelly, one clarification. I understand if the mayor of the city who's receiving money is not present at the meeting, then that money can be claimed by another municipality. Is that true?
I'm not aware of that. So
I'll speak to my friend, Mr. Wade, Mayor Wade, on that one.
It has to be a municipality that's directly adjoining to it.
That's the way it should work.
Preferably across the river, although I'm willing to split it with you.
Thank you. Council members, any questions for Kelly? Very good. We'll entertain a motion.
I move approval.
Mayor Jones moves approval.
I second that.
Who made the second, please?
James Shores.
Thank you, Mr. Shores. Any further discussion? All those in favor will signify when Kirk calls your name.
Mayor Joines voted yes. Mr. Clark, Robert,
Yes.
Ms. Adams,
Yes.
Mr. Cross,
Yes.
Mr. Rogers, John, Mike Rogers, Mr. Rogers, are you still with us? We'll move on. Ms. Fulton,
Yes.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
Mr. Byram, Mr. Marion,
Yes.
Mr. Hutchins,
Yes.
Mr. Shores voted yes. Ms. Finney,
Yes.
Mr. Morris,
Yes.
Willie,
Yes.
motion is unanimous.
Very good. Thank you, Kirk. The next item is item 3A, which we added to our agenda list. Kelly, I believe this is yours also.
yes, sir. As I mentioned earlier, this item is the amendment of the fiscal year 2020-2021 Unified Planning Work Program. The City of Winston-Salem has requested an additional $100,000 for their Winston-Salem Transit Authority route study, bringing the total for that study to a total of $200,000. The city will be responsible for the match for that study. I will answer any questions that you may have. Included in your packet is the UPWP with its amendment.
Any questions for Kelly? If not, we'll entertain a motion.
Move for approval, Dee Dee Adams.
Ms. Adams, thank you.
Rick Cross, second.
Thank you, Mr. Cross. That's motion and second. Any further discussion? Kirk, please call the roll.
Mr. Joins,
Yes.
Robert Clark,
Yes.
Ms. Adams voted yes. Mr. Cross voted yes. John Rogers, Mike Rogers,
Yes.
Ms. Fulton,
Yes.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
Mr. Byram,
Yes.
Mr. Marion,
Yes.
Mr. Hutchins,
Yes.
Mr. Shores,
Yes.
Ms. Finney,
Yes.
Mr. Morris,
Yes.
and Willie Clark.
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously.
Thank you, members. Byron, I think you have the next item on our agenda, which is consideration of the fiscal year 2029 Metropolitan amendments to the modifications to the Mtip.
Good afternoon, everyone. The 2020-2029 Metropolitan Transportation Improvement Program is a listing of all the projects programmed for the Winston-Salem urban area. This document is a subset of the 2045 Metropolitan Transportation Plan and reflects projects programming included in the state's Transportation Improvement Program. As the project schedules, funding, and programming is modified, these changes are reflected in our Mtip. Included in your materials are project modifications, additions, and deletions, including various statewide program funding modifications, as well as the addition of several projects, including Harmon Lane, South Cherry Street, and Depot Street sidewalk construction. Per our public participation plan, these amendments were made available to the public between February 15, 2021.
You let the dogs out.
March 17, 2021. No comments were received during that time. I would be more than happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Byron. Any questions for Byron on this item? If not, we'll entertain a motion.
For approval, Dee Dee Adams.
Ms. Adams makes the motion.
Second, Allen.
Mr. Joins makes the second. Any further discussion? Kirk, please call the roll.
Mr. Joins voted yes. Robert Clark, Mr. Clark, are you with us, Robert?
Yes.
Thank you. Ms. Adams votes yes. Mr. Cross,
Yes.
Mr. Rogers, John,
Yes.
Mike Rogers,
Yes.
Ms. Fulton,
Yes.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
Mr. Byram,
Yes.
Mr. Marion,
Yes.
Mr. Hutchins,
Yes.
Mr. Shores,
Yes.
Ms. Finney,
Yes.
Mr. Morris,
Yes.
and Willie Clark.
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously. Thank you.
Thank you, members. Next item, Byron, you also have, and that's consideration of a request to modify the Winston-Salem MPO's federal functional classification. That seems like an oxymoron to me, but anyway, Byron, if you'll present, please.
The functional classification of a roadway describes the current primary functional purpose of a roadway in relation to the larger area road network. Roadways are assigned one of 8 functional classifications based on its functionality, characteristics, levels of accessibility versus mobility, as well as other factors. A roadway's functional classification is used to determine federal aid, roadway design, design elements, project prioritization, as well as programming. The Winston-Salem MPO established an application and review process to determine if facilities should be either upgraded or downgraded based on factors such as ADT, land use, connectivity to the larger network, speed limits, roadway widths, control of access, as well as other factors. Between November 23rd, 2020 and December 28th, 2020, the MPO held an open call for requests to modify the existing network. The Streets and Highway Subcommittee met on February 9th, 2021 to discuss the proposed request. The attached table includes the requests and recommendations that were made by that committee. Included in that request are several road changes from Kernersville, as well as staff of the MPO doing regular maintenance to the existing network. Any approved changes that are approved by this board will then go to NCDOT for further review and then FHWA for final review. I'll be more than happy to answer any questions about this item.
Any question for Byron? Byron, I got to ask you, did you do that from memory or are you reading it?
I'll never tell.
Okay. Ms. Adams.
Mr. Brown, I noticed in some of the other reports, your audit, the audit and things like that, the certification. One of the things that the auditor spoke about was our communication and collaboration with freight companies. And I know within the city of Winston-Salem, we're seeing a lot of freight trucks use neighborhood streets and roads. Does this have any effect on that as to how we look at how, and I know that we got to have them, but do we look at that as well as to how often freight are deviating from the so-called map that they should be using and now moving to neighborhoods to travel?
The FFC does not determine which roadways that freight trucks would be taking, but that is something that we could look into and do a further investigation that would assist us with our congestion management plan as we look at more ways to incorporate freight into our planning processes.
Thank you.
Ms. Adams, is there a particular area that you want to point them to?
Well, let's just say a road. They seem to come off of Renola Road or Cherry or Indiana, and they just use. I mean, I know we have some industry in the area, but starting to get calls and complaints from citizens wanting to know, because for years, again, the average citizen doesn't know that freight, you know, the numbers of doing freight or transportation has increased exponentially over the past 5 to 10 years. And I think it's incumbent upon us to somehow help communicate that to our constituents throughout the MPO, as well as in one of the items on the agenda that speaks to us collaborating and involving freight partnerships probably more than we do. Thank you.
Very good. So noted, Ms. Adams. Thank you for your comment. Any other questions for Kirk? With that, we'll entertain paper crumbling. We'll entertain a motion.
Motion to approve.
And you got Ms. Fulton?
Second, Allen.
Mayor Joines makes the second. Any further discussion? Kirk, please call the roll.
Mr. Joines voted yes. Robert Clark,
Yes.
Ms. Adams,
Yes.
Mr. Cross,
Yes.
John Rogers,
Yes.
Mike Rogers,
Yes.
Ms. Fulton voted yes. Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
Mr. Byram,
Yes.
Mr. Marion,
Yes.
Mr. Hutchins,
Yes.
Mr. Shores,
Yes.
Ms. Finney,
Yes.
Mr. Morris,
Yes.
and Willie Clark.
Yes.
Motion is unanimous.
Thank you. Members, the next item is the first of two public hearings we'll be having this meeting. The first one is the Federal Transit Administration's 5307 funding allocation. Tanique, will you please walk us through that?
Good evening, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. This item relates to the distribution of Federal Transit Administration Formula Section 5307 funding allocations for the Winston-Salem urban area for fiscal year 2021, the programming projects, and the amendments to the 2020 through 2029 Mtip. The FTA has apportioned $5,218,153 in fiscal year 2021 to the Winston-Salem urban area for Section 5307 funding. There are 3 agencies who are eligible to receive the funding. And the distribution is consistent with the policy this MPO adopted in 2017, where the funding is distributed in accordance with the percentages developed in Table 3A by FTA. Based upon that distribution, it is recommended that Davidson County Transportation receive $186,957. The Piedmont Authority for Regional Transportation would receive $579,407, and the Winston-Salem Transit Authority would receive $4,443,605. And there's an additional $55,000 that would be used for agencies to provide the traditional job access and reverse commute type programs. We've met with all of the agencies to confirm that they were willing to accept that funding and could use it. In addition, we've also advertised and consistent with our public participation process. We've advertised the programming of projects, which outlines how these agencies will use the funds. That information was advertised between February 15th and March 17th. And we've also have a public hearing, which is scheduled to occur at this meeting. The additional item, if approved, would then update the Mtip, which would then make a recommendation to the state to update their STIP, which at that point, the agencies can apply to FTA for use of these funds. I can answer any questions you all may have.
Very good. Any questions? Ladies and gentlemen, this is a public hearing. Is there anybody, Kurt? Wait, I'm sorry, Mr. Clark.
Ms. McCullough, how do these dollar amount compare with previous years?
The total amount that we received is a little bit less than what we received last year. And the amount distributed is based upon the travel that each of the agencies report to the National Transit Database, and based upon the 2018 data that was submitted. And as you may recall, during 2018 was when NCDOT was working on Business 40. And so particularly the city of Winston-Salem in part received some funding for that project, which then probably would have affected the data reported in 2018, which reduced the funding just a little bit.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Again, ladies and gentlemen, this is a public hearing. Kirk, do we have anybody signed up to speak or indicating they wish to speak?
We do not, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. With that, we'll close the public hearing. Members, what's your preference?
I'll move approval. Clark.
Mr. Clark, approval?
Second.
I'm sorry, I didn't get the second.
Rick Cross.
Thank you, Mr. Cross. That's the second. Any further discussion? Kirk, please call the roll.
Mr. Joins. Robert Clark votes yes. Ms. Adams.
Yes.
Mr. Cross votes yes. John Rogers.
Yes.
Mike Rogers.
Yes.
Ms. Fulton.
Yes.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
John Byram.
Yes.
Mr. Marion.
Yes.
Mr. Hutchins.
Yes.
Mr. Shores.
Yes.
Ms. Finney.
Yes.
Mr. Morris.
Yes.
And Willie Clark.
Yes.
Motion is unanimous. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. Members, I apologize. I get a bit of familiarity with the staff as we work through the agenda items ahead of time, and we talk over the course of the month about what those items are going to be. So I have been addressing them as their first name, but if that's not appropriate, let me see if I can move to their last name, if I can remember their last names. Okay. Next item is also a public hearing. This is for the Federal Transit Administration 5339 Bus and Bus Facilities Grant Program. Ms. McCullough.
Thank you. This item is a a review of the Federal Transit Administration Section 5339 Bus and Bus Facilities Grant Program funding allocation for the Winston-Salem urban area fiscal year 2021, the program of projects, and an amendment to the 2020 through 2029 Mtip. This for fiscal year 2021, the Winston-Salem urban area received $580,567 of funding to be used for the purpose of the Section 5339 programming, which is to be used to replace, rehab, and purchase buses and bus facilities. This funding is being recommended to be distributed to the Winston-Salem Transit Authority. They are requesting to be able to use those funds to purchase 4 Transaid vans and 1 support vehicle, and to use the balance of the funds for facility rehab projects and capital maintenance. Similar to the 5307 program, the program of projects was advertised for the, according to our public participation program, for 30 days between February 15th and yesterday, March 17th, and a public hearing is scheduled to occur at this meeting. Should this funding distribution be approved, then it would also be an update to our Mtip, and we would then make that recommendation for an update to the STIP so that WISTA can then apply for the use of these funds. I can answer any questions you may have.
Members, any questions? Very good. This is a public hearing, ladies and gentlemen. Kirk, do we have anybody who wishes to speak?
No, we don't, Mr. Chairman.
With that, we'll close the public hearing. Members, what's your pleasure?
I'll move approval. Robert Clark.
Is that Mr. Clark? Thank you.
Second, this is Alan.
Thank you, Mayor Joines. That's the second. There's a motion and a second on the floor. Any further discussion? Very good. Kirk, you please call the roll.
Mr. Joines voted yes. Mr. Clark voted yes. Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Cross?
Yes.
John Rogers?
Yes.
Mike Rogers?
Yes.
Ms. Fulton?
Yes.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Mr. Byram?
Yes.
Mr. Marion?
Yes.
Mr. Hutchins?
Yes.
Mr. Shores?
Yes.
Ms. Finney? Morris?
Yes.
And Mr. Clark? Willie?
Yes.
Motion is unanimous. Thank you.
Thank you, members. We have a request by staff to schedule a special meeting on April 15th to consider 3 specific items that are need to come to our attention prior to our next regular meeting in May. Kelly, do you want me to introduce the various presenters on this, or would you like to take the lead?
I can do it, sir.
Okay. First item is the review of the fiscal year 2022 federal congestion mitigation and air quality call for projects. Ms. Bailiff, I believe you're there to tell us about this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is CMAQ. It stands for Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality. It's a federal program that funds transportation projects and programs in air quality, non-attainment, and maintenance areas to aid in the achievement and maintenance of national standards for air quality pollutants. In North Carolina, the NCDOT is the administrator for the CMAQ program. Funding is apportioned to North Carolina based on population and non-attainment and maintenance areas of the state, and also based on the severity of the air quality problem. For fiscal year 2022, NCDOT has allocated $1,794,028 to Winston-Salem MPO. We have 2 candidate projects this year that were submitted, and the city of Winston-Salem requested $920,000 for WISTA night, Saturday, and Sunday service, as well as $874,028 for bus replacement and capital items. Currently, the Office of Environmental Assistance and Protection is in the process of evaluating both of these projects to determine the annual pollutant reduction in kilograms. They use a series of computer models that estimate the average emissions for different types of highway vehicles. And since they are still working on the emissions data, we will not be able to give you specific numbers at this meeting, but we will have that data for you at the April meeting. Are there any questions?
Any questions, members? And we will be voting on this on April 15th.
Correct.
If not, we'll entertain a motion. Next week on April 15th. Yeah, that's allergy medicine kicking in. Mr. Brown, you have the next item, which is a review of the amendments to the 2020 Comprehensive Transportation Plan.
Okay. On January 21st, 2021, the Winston-Salem Urban Area MPO adopted the Comprehensive Transportation Plan update. The CTP is a multimodal long-range planning document which is not fiscally constrained and identifies the community's transportation needs up to 2045. Staff worked with VHB consultant firm on the updates of this document. As required, as this is a state-required document, after adoption by the TAC, this was then provided to the Transportation Planning Division of NCDOT. For their review, we are submitting the following amendments and modifications to the CTP update plan. These changes to the plan will update the maps so that they follow CTP 2.0 standards. This will also include project descriptions and summary needs statements, as well as an updated inventory table, which reflects these changes. This also updates the plan to reflect the most recent amendments to the state's Transportation Improvement Program, or STIP, on projects and schedules identified in our area. For the attached changes, I'll be more than happy to answer any questions about any of the attached amendments.
Any questions for Mr. Brown? If not, members will entertain a motion.
Cool. Robert Clark.
Mr. Clark makes the motion. Thank you.
Second, James Shores.
Thank you, Mr. Shores. We have a motion and a second. Any further discussion?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, ma'am.
I think this was a future item. It's
Right.
information for this month.
Well, you know, that's twice I've done that, isn't it? I did that with the last one and I did that with this one.
You need to consider.
You're correct. But you know, I don't feel so badly because I had somebody give a motion in a second. So I know it's not just Thank you, Ms. McCullough. I appreciate that. We have one more informational item. Mr. Brown, will you pick us up on item number 11, the review of fiscal 2020-29 Mtip amendments?
No problem. The 2020-2029 Metropolitan Transportation Improvement Program, again, is a listing of all the projects programmed for the Winston-Salem urban area. This document is a subset of the 2045 Metropolitan Transportation Plan and reflects project program included in the state's Transportation Improvement Program. As projects, funding, and program is modified, these changes are reflected in our MTIP. Including your materials are project modifications, additions, and deletions, including various statewide program fund modifications, as well as Salisbury Ridge Road construction delays. These amendments are being made available for public comment between March 12th, 2021 and April 17th, 2021. These amendments will come to the board for action at the April 15th meeting. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for Mr. Brown? Very good. I knew we needed a motion in here someplace, and now's the time when we actually have to do that motion, and that's to go ahead and set a special meeting for April 15th to consider the previous three items. Is there a motion, please?
That the PAC hold a special meeting on April 15th at 12:15.
Ed Jones makes the motion.
Second, Rick Cross.
Mr. Cross makes the second. Any further discussion? So, Ms. McCullough, should I do the roll now? Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, please. Kirk, if you could do the roll, please. Thank you.
Mr. Joins voted yes. Mr. Clark, Robert?
Yes.
Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Cross voted yes. Don Rogers?
Yes.
Mike Rogers?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Mr. Byram, are you still with us?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Marion,
Yes.
Mr. Hutchins,
Yes.
Mr. Shores,
Yes.
Ms. Finney,
Yes.
Ms. Finney, are you still in the meeting?
Yes.
Mr. Morris,
Yes.
and Willie Clark.
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously. Thank you. That's the last item needing a motion today.
Kurt, record me as a yes.
Will do. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for the cue, Kirk. I appreciate that. Our next item is a preface to that. I'd like to congratulate our staff. As you know, they do an amazing amount of work, planning programs that have to be submitted to the federal government to certify that we are doing things correctly. Ms. Garvin and Ms. Morales, I think will speak to this next one, but first off, congratulations to the staff for receiving the certification process for, I guess it's called the Federal Transit Administration on your planning process for our MPO. So great work, guys. Ms. Garvin, Ms. Morales, how about you can stand up and take a bow, or you can tell us what this is about.
Thank you, sir. The item before you is simply just a review of the report from Federal Highway and Federal Transit Administration pertaining to the federal certification review that was held in December of 2020. At least every 4 years, Federal Highway and Federal Transit Administration they must conduct a review to jointly certify that the Metropolitan Transportation Planning process in the MPO are done in accordance to all federal guidance and all federal law. Included in your packet is the report that was drafted by Federal Highway Administration and the FTA for your review. And we have on the line, I think Suzette Morales is on the line to give us some comments about the report.
Ms. Morales, are you there?
Yes, I am here. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to the MPO board and the staff for a successful certification review. It was really awesome having Mayor Mike Horn there, and he really gave some great commendations about the work that the MPO is doing. So like Kelly said, the certification review is done every 4 years to ensure that the MPO is meeting its federal requirements. And it's also a way for us to know what type of best practices any of our MPOs have that we could recommend to other MPOs within North Carolina. The certification review, it started with a desk review. And with a desk review, we look at documents that are available to us that should be actually also available to the public. So we go onto the website or we request items from the MPO staff, such as your UPWP or your MOU. We request those things and then we review them to make sure they meet federal requirements. In other certification reviews in the past, they were 3 days long, and everyone have like a stack of papers like this high, and we'd be going through everything. But things we're doing it a little differently this time. It's more of a risk base. So we wound up actually only having 2 half days versus a full 3 days. So it's a risk based, meaning what are certain areas that are considered high risk. So for example, there's a topic of your boundaries. Boundaries aren't necessarily a high risk topic, but maybe the planning, the UPWP could be a risk area. So when you go through the report, you'll see that not every topic is on there, but areas that were considered potential risks. And when you review it, it could be that it was a potential risk, but through our discussions with the MPO and through our desk review, it was discovered that it wasn't a risk after all. So at the end, it culminates, after the desk review, it culminates with us meeting with the MPO staff. So us meaning FHWA and FTA. We meet with them, and then we go through just some questions and discussions about those potential risk areas, and they culminate into a report. So you guys have received the report, and so please make sure to look at it. And if you have any questions, certainly, reach out to me, and I'll make sure to answer any questions that you have. But I'll go through a few of the recommendations and commendations for the MPO. Like Mayor Mike Horn said, the MPO did, in fact, succeed in their certification review. The only way you wouldn't is if there were federal findings that required significant action, but there were only a few recommendations, and there were actually commendations for things that the MPO are doing really well. So I'll just go through a few of those things. If you could scroll through, and we'll start with the previous findings. So in section 1.1 of the report talks about previous findings from the last 4 years certification review. And so we look to see if those recommendations have been met since that last review. And all of them have been met except for one, which was freight planning. So the recommendation that still remains now is that there's more incorporation of the freight community within planning, whether that's the MTP or the UPAP or just the MPO's transportation planning in general. And then continuing down to current findings, you'll see a list of several recommendations, and each of those have a timeline for when we would like those recommendations to be met. So like one minor one is, you might not see me I'm looking at another screen, so at the report, because it's a little bit bigger. So one example is the UPWP. So there was a recommendation that this annual self-certification, that it includes the two most recent planning factors. So that's something that, even though it happened during the cert review, it actually got resolved pretty quickly, after that. The planning division is the one who provides the information, and so they just updated the forms and we were good to go. So another recommendation was in, let's see, one of the bigger recommendations was environmental mitigation and planning environmental linkages. With this one, the recommendation, so in reviewing the MTP, even though there were environmental features identified, the environmental features also needed to be overlaid with projects. So you look at the projects, you look at those environmental features, and you see, are there any potential impacts? And is there a way that we can mitigate it early enough so that by the time we go into actual project development, we don't have as huge of an impact and it doesn't take us as long to get through that process? So the recommendation is to have those projects on that environmental features map, and also to have more agency consultation with all those environmental agencies. So, and that's something that we would like to have done by the next certification review, which is basically when the next MTP will be anyway. So even though we have these recommendations, we're certainly, as FTA and FHWA, we will work with the MPO staff to with any assistance they need, or if there's any training that the MPO would like, to help them meet these recommendations. But there were certainly plenty of commendations. One of our specialists in FHWA, a civil rights specialist, She had very good things to say about the MPO and their work with identifying groups that are characterized with environmental justice. So our civil rights specialist, she wanted to commend the staff in their pedestrian plan, in their public involvement, how they were able to identify which zip codes they had engaged with to ensure that they were meeting areas where there were communities of concern. So that was a really good commendation from her, and overall just the MPO's public involvement techniques. We're very pleased with what the MPO has done. So again, I really want to thank the staff and for all of their work with the MPO. And please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Morales. Appreciate your presentation today and your recognition of the work that our staff does.
Thanks.
Very good. Any questions, members? All righty. Ms. Adams, I believe at the last meeting you asked for some additional information on the DOT's target safety performance measures, and we can pick that up and maybe address some of those specific things. Ms. Bailiff is back again, and Mr. Murphy to run through those for us. I think you had some specific issues that you wanted them to take a look at.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Per the Federal Highway Administration's Highway Safety Improvement Program, the NCDOT has to coordinate the establishment of safety targets with the MPOs in the state. The review of progress towards meeting these goals must be tracked and reported annually in the Highway Safety Improvement Plan annual report. At the end of August every year, NCDOT sets the targets for the state's safety performance measures, and MPOs have 180 days to either adopt the state's targets or set their own. This year, on January 21st, the Winston-Salem TAC approved a resolution of support for the state's safety targets. But as you pointed out, Mr. Chairman, TAC expressed interest in the tracking of the safety data. So we have with us today Brian Mayhew and Brian Murphy. They're both engineers with NCDOT and will be making a presentation on safety performance measures and tracking. And I believe Mr. Mayhew is going to start us off.
Thank you, Victoria. I appreciate that. So yes, today we're going to just briefly go over some traffic safety data trends related to what's going on in North Carolina. There'll just be some statewide data trends at first, and then Brian Murphy will follow up with some information that's more specific to your MPO. We'll touch briefly on the safety performance measures and kind of how this information can relate to each other. Some of the data trends that we'll touch on today briefly will be population and travel, and then we'll dig in a little bit deeper into some of the crash trends that we're experiencing in North Carolina. So for background, it's important to understand that in 2019, North Carolina adopted a strategic highway safety plan. This is a broad-based plan for safety that includes our infrastructure program, but also enforcement and education and encouragement efforts as well. So there's a broad plan. It's done by NCDOT, but it's meant for the state as a whole. But one of the most important things that this plan has accomplished was to set a goal for North Carolina, and that's to reduce all fatalities and serious injuries by half by 2035, moving towards zero by 2050. And that goal informs our safety programs and can help inform the decisions that other groups make as well. So as I'm sure you all are aware, we're in a growing state. Most of the southern states are experiencing fairly rapid population growth, and North Carolina is no exception. The population growth is primarily in urban areas, and it does have a connection with our crash and fatality trends. So it's important for our safety programs to recognize where the population growth is occurring and what we may need to do on adjusting our programs in order to accommodate that growth, but also still get a decrease in fatalities and serious injuries. Vehicle miles traveled is one metric that we often look at as a measure of activity across the state. And this is basically a count of miles traveled by vehicles in North Carolina. It is an estimate, but it's fairly reliable. The red bars at the bottom are rural VMT across the state. And as you can see, it's pretty stable. There's not a lot of change from year to year. Our rural areas do experience the majority of our fatalities and serious injuries, but they carry a significant less amount of our travel.
Mr. Murphy, let me just interrupt you for one quick second. Members, if you would please once again check and be sure you're muted. I think I just heard several members leaving out of the back door, so if you'll mute yourself, that would be great.
Yeah, it's hard to make this topic real exciting, but so yeah, they left out the back door. I understand.
I'm on the edge of my seat. Please continue.
All right, thank you. The blue bars represent our urban VMT, and that is increasing. And so we do have to recognize that most of the growth in traffic in North Carolina is being experienced in our urban areas. And again, our safety programs need to recognize that. The green bar on the far right, that is our estimate for miles traveled in 2020, and that had decreased significantly, and that's due to COVID. So most of that decrease in traffic occurred in the spring, in that March, April, May, June timeframe, and it has had a significant impact on our data in North Carolina, which we'll touch on in just a minute. So this is probably the most important metric that we look at when it comes to safety, and this is.
You only have the one.
Excuse me again, Mr. Murphy. Members, let me, I'm sure almost all of you are muted. However, there is one person that's not muted, and I think you're rearranging your living room while we're in the middle of this presentation. If you could mute yourself, that would be great.
All right.
Thank you so much. Please continue.
All right, I will. Thank you. So fatalities is one of the most important metrics that we look at for pretty clear and obvious reasons. And unfortunately, in 2020, it's been a pretty bad year. 1,649 fatalities just in 2020 alone in North Carolina. That's the highest number of fatalities since 2007, and it's one of the highest since the early 1970s. It increased about 11% over 2019, and that's a very significant jump. That is not common. And so what you had in 2020 was a pretty significant decrease in volume of miles traveled in VMT, but a significant increase in fatalities, and that is unusual. And we'll continue to dig into that more. But as you can see, even without the increase in 2020, we've been increasing steadily since 2011. And so if our goal is to reduce fatalities by half by 2035, and our actual trend is going the opposite direction. So it just speaks to that we need to collaborate more, and we need to do more in this area. Serious injuries is another metric that we look at in North Carolina. This graph is a little bit odd because we had a serious injury definition change in 2016, and it basically changed the way that police officers define a serious injury. So really, if you look at 2017 through 2020, it shows a moderate increase in serious injuries in North Carolina. The increase in 2020 was not nearly as significant as the fatality increase. Bicycle and pedestrian fatalities and serious injuries. And this graph, we've combined bicycle and pedestrian data together, as well as fatalities and serious injuries together. And our bicycle numbers in North Carolina are fairly small. Pedestrian fatalities are increasing, and they're increasing rather significantly, especially in urban areas. And this is also a national trend, but it's more pronounced in North Carolina and many other southern states. Most of the pedestrian fatalities most of that increase in recent years, since around 2009 and 10, has been in urban areas, has been on urban arterials, which are high-speed, busy roads, and many of those fatalities have occurred at night. So that's just something for our programs to continue to look into more. Reported crashes. So our programs really focus on fatalities and serious injuries because those are the most harmful events that harm our friends and neighbors across the state. but we do look at reported crashes as well. There's a lot of crashes in North Carolina each year that are reported, and many, many more that are not required to be reported. So in 2019, we had over 316,000 crashes in North Carolina. As you can see, it's been going up fairly steadily as well. We had a big drop in 2020, and again, that's due to COVID. That's due to the reduction in travel. So 2020 was an odd year. You had a huge decrease in crashes, moderate decrease in miles traveled, but a very large increase in fatalities. And that just, again, speaks to some of the complexities that we have in traffic safety. At this time, we're going to shift to Brian Murphy, and Brian Murphy is going to go over some of the data that's more specific to your NPO. Thank you.
Can I ask a question before you leave this?
Yes, sir, absolutely.
In your graph of total vehicle deaths, did that include the pedestrian and, yeah, that one, does that 1649 include pedestrians and bicycle?
It does. So this graph includes all fatalities.
Everything. Okay.
It includes everything. And one thing I'll point out is that it's not a great way of saying it, but it's a body count, right? So some fatal, so it's not just the number of crashes, it's the number of people killed in those crashes.
Okay. And going back, because I know that nationwide the numbers dropped considerably. If you went back to, say, the 1970s, what would this number look like?
That's a good question. So the numbers in the early 1970s would be in the 1500s to 1800s, and I think it peaked in the 1900s.
Okay.
1970s were not a great year for traffic safety, or not a great decade. But we've made significant progress since then. But then this year, we've gone back in the wrong direction.
I remember many years ago, you used to be around 50,000 a year killed in the country. Now it's about 35. And a lot of that has to do with, I think, the drunk driving laws and things of that sort. But anyway, thank you.
You're welcome. And I'll mention that a lot of the improvements that we did experience are collaborative in nature. So it's you mentioned drunk driving and alcohol, airbags and seat belts and braking. I mean, there's been a lot of improvements. And then, of course, hopefully we're doing some good on the infrastructure side as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, as Brian Mayhew mentioned, I'm going to go through many of the same trends that Brian just went through, but I'm going to kind of give a little bit of perspective of maybe what's going on within your MPO boundaries. And the first one being VMT. I know we spoke about VMT being a good measure of activity, and of course that has an impact on crashes as well. And you can see, our statewide numbers in the last 10 years or so have gone up by about 20%. And the same with your MPO, it's gone up about that same level at about 20%. So we've got increasing activity on the road. So of course that leads to an increased opportunity for collisions as well. I should spend just a couple more minutes maybe on this slide. All of the subsequent slides are set the same way. So the statewide numbers will always be in red here, and the numbers for the Winston-Salem MPO will always be in blue. So again, this is just meant to kind of give you just some perspective of maybe the trends that have been occurring in your MPO boundary within the last 10 years or so. Reported crashes, again, this is something that we look at, and you can see in the last 10 years at a statewide level, we've increased our reported crashes by about 80,000 per year, which is a huge number. And if you look at those numbers just for Winston-Salem MPO, we've increased from about 9,000 to over 16,000. So almost doubled there in just the last 10 years. So a lot more activity, a lot more opportunity for crashes, and we're certainly seeing that when we look at these types of measures. Fatal crashes. So, and this is looking at fatal crashes, so the actual crash event itself. And so, once we get this down to the MPO level, you do see fewer numbers, so you will see the numbers vary a good bit more from year to year. So you'll see a little bit more variation in those trend lines. Are not quite as smooth, but you can see within your MPO boundary, anywhere from 32 fatalities a year to 50 fatalities per year, fatal crashes per year. So good bit of variance there. And again, of course, put a trend line through that. It's certainly an increasing trend if we're looking at kind of the direction that we're headed. serious injury crashes here, and again, I'll note what Brian Mayhew said about the definition change. So that's going to explain that biggest spike there. But if you're looking at serious injury changes just from the last 10 years, so Winston-Salem was about 50 in 2010, and then 2019 was about 150. So increased by about 3 times there. And again, some of that is explained by that definition change. But certainly an increasing trend, really, no matter how you look at that. Non-motorized fatal and serious injury crashes. So again, non-motorized, just think bike and bed when you see that. That kind of plays into some of the safety targets and performance measure language that we'll get into in just a minute. But again, an increasing trend. No matter how you parse out this data, you see that whether you look at it at a national level or state level, or of course down to the MPO level as well. Pedestrian crashes. So if you look at pedestrian crashes, again, increasing trend, no matter how you look at it. But if you look just specifically at Winston-Salem MPO, 2010, you're at about 45 pedestrian crashes. And then in 2019 at about 120. So quite an increase there as well, just in pedestrian crashes in general. Bicycle crashes, again, at the statewide levels is kind of flattened out, maybe some decreases if you look at a pretty long trend. But a little bit of an increase here if you're looking at, what's the activity within the Winston-Salem MPO. And then just to give some perspective of kind of, where crashes are occurring within your MPO boundary, what cities, are the most crashes occurring at. No surprise, Winston-Salem, obviously the biggest city there, has the most crashes and the most fatal and serious injury crashes. One thing to note there is the rural crashes. And rural here just means anything outside of a municipal boundary. So realize there's many ways to explain rural, but here it's just defined as outside of a municipal boundary. So particularly when you look at the fatal and serious injury events, you'll see that the rural has a bigger share in that. And that's, that's not much of a surprise. We do see more severe injury crashes in rural areas, generally speaking, throughout the state, just because you tend to have higher speeds and you may have some roadside challenges in some areas as well. Another way to look at that just a little bit more graphically, looking at total reported crashes and kind of where those fall within the municipalities within your boundary. Again, obviously Winston-Salem having the biggest area and the most congestion, that would lead to the more of the reported total crashes there. And then looking at that from a fatal crash perspective as well. So a lot of different ways to look at this data. And with that, I guess before we go to safety performance measures, were there any questions specifically on the MPO trends that we want to address now?
Mr. Murphy.
Yes, sir.
James Shores from Davidson County. So in your fatality data, and I understand, I'm a police officer, just so you know my background, and a reconstructionist, but in your data, the fatalities, is the fatalities that may have been a medical, where the person had a medical issue and maybe expired prior to the crash, is that incorporated in this data, or is it strictly from the crash event itself?
Yeah, and so our source of data is the DMV crash database, and so they do go and kind of cleanse, especially the fatality data. So if the fatal was related to a medical event, that should have been cleaned out and accounted for separately. So it should not make it into these numbers. So they should just be traffic related without fatalities.
Thanks, sir.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Murphy, this is Rick Cross from Run. And somebody may have mentioned this, but how much of this could be attributed to increase in population, increase in miles driven? If you were to lay that on top of this, how would it look?
Yeah, and it certainly plays a factor. Of course, all those indicators of activity, the more activity you have, the more opportunity for crashes. So yeah, it's certainly a factor. when you look at that for 2020, that doesn't quite play out, particularly at the statewide level. And again, we don't have these numbers parsed out to the MPO level just yet, but we'll have that information for 2020 very soon. But it's certainly a factor. I mean, the more activity you have, the more opportunity you have for crashes. And then you saw some of the statewide trends. Statewide BMT has gone down, but the fatality numbers have gone up. So 2020 COVID, I mean, it's weird however you look at it. And it's something that we're certainly digging into and that we're looking into a lot more. There's a ton of research that's being done in this area as well. And that's what we're excited about is, what can we learn from 2020 and apply it to quote normal times, whatever normal is going to look like once we get beyond this. Yeah, great question.
And to follow that up with another question, Mr. Murphy, on the chart where you're showing rural versus municipal areas, where the municipal limits actually cross over a major highway like 40, 52 or something like that, does those municipals tend to have higher, percentages of access because of those higher, those heavier traveled roadways going through their city limits versus others?
Yeah, it kind of goes back to that previous question. So yeah, certainly if you have a major highway that's going through your municipal limits, then you got more activity. So you got that, more opportunity for crashes. So you would likely see an increase particularly in like total crashes in some of those where you've got, again, that's more related to just the amount of activity that may be present. Okay. So with that, I'm going to quickly kind of go through safe performance measures. I know there may have been some questions about this last time, and I'll give a little bit of background, talk a little bit about the assessment that we just went through with FHWA, and then talk about very quickly about your 2021 safety performance measures. I know you guys have already adopted the state measures, so I'm going to hopefully make that very quick and painless. A little bit of background on performance measures. So MAP 21, FAST Act, these federal transportation funding acts basically required state DOTs and MPOs to set targets for 5 Highway Safety Improvement Program or HSIP performance measures. And you see those performance measures there in the middle of the screen. And so those measures are number of fatalities and serious injuries and the rate of fatalities and serious injuries, and then a separate category for those non-motorized fatality and serious injuries. Couple things about those targets there, and this is prescribed by FHWA, so each state has to do these exactly the same in this manner. So they're all based on 5-year rolling averages. They're all for calendar years. So the targets you just adopted are for calendar year 2021, and these are established annually. So this is, you guys have been through this a few times, so you realize that this is something that, an exercise that we go through yearly. And then our reporting dates, again, we report to federal highways in August, by the end of August, and then the MPOs report by the end of February. So how are the targets set? So it's really up to each state and MPO on how they set their targets. So there is a good bit of flexibility in this area. And the MPO can adopt the state's methodology, or they can come up with their own. And we talked a little bit already about how those targets are set in North Carolina, and those are really come out of our state strategic highway safety plan. And that's a plan to address safety that's developed in a collaborative approach with a diverse group of safety stakeholders, and there's state, regional, and local partners there. There's MPO representation, there's RPO representation, there's the public sector and private sector as well, and then you got kind of these 4 E's represented as well. So education, enforcement, engineering, emergency services. And again, it represents that collaborative approach of how we want to look at reducing fatalities and serious injuries on our roadways. And as Brian Mayhew mentioned earlier in the talk, we adopted this goal of reducing fatalities and serious injuries by half by the year 2035, moving towards 0 by 2050. And so it's a very aggressive goal, but this is an area that we feel like we need to be aggressive in. And we use that as the basis for our state level target setting. I'm going to skip this slide and talk more to this one. So obviously, to develop these measures, we have all our historical data, so we know where we are as far as fatalities. are in our, for historic purposes, 2019, 2020 now, we know where we are. Obviously, we can create those 5-year rolling averages that FHWA wants us to report on. And then from our strategic highway safety plan, we know where we want to be. So that plan set a goal of in 2035, we want to be at half of what we were in 2019. And so obviously we can do a little bit of math and find out, where we need to be at each point in time to be on target to meeting that goal. And that's exactly how those targets are set at the state level. And again, if you adopt the state methodology, it's that exact same exercise at the MPO level. So that was a little bit of background on kind of safety performance measures in general. I want to spend a couple minutes just talking about the assessment that we recently went through with federal highways. So FHWA does assess the state annually as to whether or not they made or significant progress towards meeting our HSIP safety targets. And our first assessment was conducted early last year, early 2020, and they were for calendar year 2018 targets. And just a note here that FHWA does not directly assess the MPO progress toward those targets, but obviously, if we're going to meet those targets at a statewide level, we're all in this together. So it takes a good bit of collaboration. This is kind of a busy slide. I'll just hit on just this, that, based on FHWA's review, North Carolina did not meet or make significant progress toward achieving its safety performance targets. And there's a lot of numbers on the slide, but you see a lot of no's, and that's kind of what I wanted to point out, is that we did not meet those targets. You see those there for the statewide and then also for the Winston-Salem area as well. And again, we picked it's a very aggressive target that we picked. So these are going to be, they're going to be difficult targets to meet. Okay, so a little bit of background on the performance measures and then the assessment. Quickly talk about the 2021 safety performance measures. This is going to be real quick because you guys have already adopted yours. And so the statewide numbers are there. And of course, this information will be presented later and included in the packet if you're interested. I'm sure probably what you're more interested in is maybe numbers specific to your MPO boundary. And so the top half of that slide there shows the actual metrics for those 5 categories throughout the years. And then the bottom there shows the target setting. So that's where we take those 5-year rolling averages as FHWA prescribes. And you'll see that the units may be a little bit wonky. We get asked about that a lot. So it's prescribed exactly how we will report those, even down to the decimal place. So that's why, some of that may look a little bit different to you. I wanted to close just by letting you know of a few resources. Again, this is not really meant to be consumed on a slide, but more for kind of reference if you get this information emailed to you. So there's a lot of good resources there if you want more background on performance measures in general, and then there's some North Carolina data there as well. And then on our website, there's a good bit of information there specific to each MPO as well. So you can go there and find some MPO specific crash data. And then there's a lot of links here as well. So again, this is not meant to be consumed really in the slide, but there's a lot of information that's out there related to safety, a lot of map safety data. I'll show you just a couple of those just really quickly. One thing that we have that's pertinent to this conversation is all of our fatal and serious injury crashes are mapped. And so you can very easily kind of zoom around the state and look and see, where are fatal and serious injury crashes occurring. And if you want to know more information, you can click on each crash and you can see maybe what could be contributing to some of those crashes. So it's good. It's easy. It's just like a Google map. You can kind of go around and explore, maybe see where some of these areas are occurring. The other thing I'll mention is that all our safety projects are also mapped. And so you can quickly kind of look at those and see maybe what's the status. Is that project complete? Is it funded? Is it under construction? Is it one that's kind of on the list that's competing for funding? And so again, I'll just leave it at that. There's a lot of good resources that are out there. We'll be happy to go into in depth into any more of those. If we want to come back later and talk in depth on any topic, we'll be more than happy to do that. But I think with that, there's our contact information. I'm sure that was a lot of information, but we'll be happy to take maybe any other questions you may have at this point.
Mr. Murphy, one quick question. The actual crash data that you were looking at on that last map where you could click on where the the incident was, and it would tell you the information there. Was that contained in your presentation that we've received in our briefing book?
It was, yes, sir. It's on that last slide that has the resources, so it's there.
Very good, thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Clark.
I think it would be helpful, and maybe to our police department or traffic folks, to know more specifically accidents or fatalities by type. For example, was it speed, alcohol, 2-lane, 4-lane road, things of that sort, to see what the trends are.
Yeah, and that's something that we can certainly provide. Data typically is not an issue. We can provide data and we can parse it out, however best meets your needs. And so, yeah, if we want to talk.
I think even at your level, I think it would be of interest to know if it's speed that's killing folks, or alcohol, or I'm not sure what else would come into play, road conditions, bad weather, or whatever. Anyway, just you got to peel the onion back a few layers sometimes just to know what, because I've noticed in Winston, I think our fatality rates are going up, and that's more anecdotal, but I think your numbers bear that out. But I have a hard time grasping why.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And so we do have a lot of programs that get into that why, the why and the where. And so I'm going to just pop one thing on the screen here that kind of gets at what you're saying. So yeah, we certainly look at this from the statewide level. We look at this at various different levels, but looking at information that kind of gets us down to the why. So this is just one example of that. This is one that we look at. Fatal trends. This is a year to date, so this is actually looking at 2021 compared to 2020, and then also a 5-year year to date average. So it's looking at a lot of these different areas, and so a lot of our focus is on kind of the engineering side. So kind of the where and the why. So where are these crashes occurring at? What are the patterns? And then if there are patterns there, then let's address a project that directly counteracts those patterns and try to get it on the ground as quickly as we can.
Yeah. And just one last comment. I know time is late.
Yeah.
My wife got a new car last December, and I'm amazed at the technology change. And she has a Subaru. I don't like to drive it because it always beeps at me if I start to get out of the lane or whatever. It notifies you if someone's braking in front of you. But I think the answer to a lot of traffic issues is, I guess that's artificial intelligence or whatever you want to call it. That at some point, I think vehicles will talk to each other, and the car ahead of you will tell your car, "I'm slowing down. You need to do something too," or whatever it may be. So thank you.
Yes, thank you. Yep, certainly a lot of research in that area, and that's where we're headed. Some people are more comfortable with that than others, but you're absolutely right. That's where we're headed.
Was that PCAS in the airplanes?
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I know a lot of people would say, it's not interesting, but for some of us it is, because people are dying, and we need to understand why. Mr. Chair, are we going to see an update every time we meet on this, or monthly or quarterly or something? Maybe not as in detail, but in a condensed state, that we can see how our MPO is doing. And I'm interested in, to the engineers, when you start to prepare the corrective and preventive action, like back in the 70s and 80s, when the message was, wear a seatbelt. And it finally became ingrained. And normally when you hear some of these incidents, people weren't wearing them. And it's not like everybody doesn't know you need to wear a seatbelt. So I'm wondering, is the state going to do a vast marketing, citizen public education piece that starts to let people know so-and-so died, like he used to show with the prom thing, drunk driving? Do you want to be one of these statistics and show them how many people have died on our highways due to various reasons, but mostly because of human error and what we do?
I think that's a good point. And as far as coming back to future meetings, I do think that would be possible for us to develop a quarterly update. Monthly can be misleading with safety data because you may not have a lot of changes from month to month, or you may have a lot of noise in the data. But certainly quarterly, I think we could probably develop like a quick, 3-5 minute type of brief update that either we could give or somebody else could give, so that you're able to see that. We are developing some additional dashboards and websites as well that should help with that, where anybody would be able to pull up that information. Hopefully we'll have that ready to go in the next few months. But you guys are all asking great questions. We know a lot about safety. We know a lot about how to prevent fatalities. But at the same time, it is an ongoing challenge. I will say that over 75% of the fatalities involve one or more of not wearing a seatbelt, speed, or alcohol. So those three issues that have been around since the 70s still result in over 3/4 of all the fatalities in the state. We still have 40% of the people who die on the roads in North Carolina are not wearing a seatbelt. 40%. And that's just one of the most basic things that you can do. So if you ever want to yell at somebody, tell them to wear a seatbelt.
Mr. Mayhew, if you guys would coordinate with Ms. Garvin, and maybe we could arrange to make that a quarterly part of our agenda at our TAC meetings.
We'll be glad to.
Very good. Any more questions for Mr. Murphy or Mr. Mayhew? Yes, sir. Let's see here. I know there's a hand up because I just saw it. Mr. McIntosh, was that you?
McIntosh. Yeah, I just want to chime in on what Councilmember or Mayor Pro Tem Burke said. I think it's impossible to engineer our way out of these fatality increases. It's a social problem. We need a Mothers Against Drunk Driving campaign. Until it's uncool to speed through neighborhoods, you're going to have these impacts and the anxiety around people speeding through neighborhoods. So, I mean, you can do only so much with engineering. You can only make a road so safe. And then it's, it's the people behind the wheel of 250 horsepower cars that are on the roadway now. So, my 2 cents.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. McIntosh. Anyone else? Very good. Thank you. So we are at the point where we generally ask members if they would like to hear any of the staff reports, if you glance through those. And then if any of them pique your interest, if you would like to have a staff report of any one of those topics, this is a great time to ask for those. Very good. We always give you a chance to speak because, I'm sorry?
Just want to let you know that I was present. This is Alamein.
Okay, Mr. Alamein, thank you. Mr. Ivey, we always give you a chance to say hello. Do you have anything going on that we should know about?
Actually, no major changes since my last report, and everything is up to date and always available to answer questions if you have any.
Very good. Members, before we adjourn, any comments? Any thoughts? Very good. Thank you all for sticking with us. This was a weighty meeting. For those of you that went through the briefing book, there was a lot of material in there to try to digest, and it was all very helpful. Once again, staff, congratulations on your great work. We are always proud when we're able to boast about your activities around the state. So thank you very much. With that, members, we'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Mr. Chairman, I have one thing I needed to share.
Yes, ma'am.
We will email out, I'm sorry. I was excited about leaving, I almost forgot.
Just as long as you don't make a motion.
I will not. We received an email from FHWA reminding us about the fact that our MPO is not allowed to use federal funding for lobbying. And I'll just read the brief statement that they provided, and then staff will then send out the full email just as a reminder. FHWA did not make it specific to anything that we did, but we were asked a couple of months ago to provide a letter to Congress, and I'm not sure if this is in response to the MPO actually sending that letter. but the statement says that FHWA NC Division became aware of a situation where an MPO is lobbying to Congress. This is a reminder that MPOs are not allowed to use federal planning funds to lobby Congress. This includes paying for MPO staff to draft associated letters. Individual board members may write to their representatives as long as state or local laws allow, but these letters should not appear to be letters from the MPO. And they reference 2 CFR in the email, and so we will share it with our board, but it was just a reminder from them on things that we should prohibit, we should keep from doing, and so I thought I would mention it and before we sent the email to everyone so that you'll have a basis of understanding.
Thank you, Ms. McCullough. Members, for those of you that remember, that was our decision to talk about the release of federal funds, I believe, wasn't it, Ms. McCullough?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So so we just now know to sit still, shut up, and stand in the corner. Thank you very much, folks in Washington. We appreciate you. With that, we'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved, Rick Cross.
Mr. Cross, thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Mr. Alameen, thank you. Any further discussion? Kurt, call the roll, please.
Mr. Chairman, we don't need a roll call for this item. Just acclamation by all was good enough.
Very good. By unanimous acclamation, then, we are adjourned. Thank you.
Have a good day.